Patch 3.25, Settlers of Kalguur is here. I'm going to show you everything you need to know to play Splitting Steel Champion in this season. Now, this is a league starter, so I will be showing the different gems you should be acquiring, act, etc., and explaining things on a bit more of a beginner-friendly level, versus my endgame guides, which you should subscribe for, by the way, which will be coming out later this season, and I do cover all ARPGs now, which will be a bit more, obviously, endgame focused. So without further ado, let's jump into it. Starting off then with what to expect and some of the pros and cons that you're going to get from this build. Obviously, it revolves around the Splitting Steel gem. And this is really interesting because of how it works. Now, obviously, it's on screen right now, and it's going to kind of work like a ranged build, but also a melee build at the time, where you're shooting out all of these missiles, decimating everything on screen. So you could guess I call it a ranged caster melee build. You are attacked, but your coverage and clear makes it feel like you're cheating a bit because of the mechanics with your projectile skills. So you're just like a cannon, firing out a million projectiles everywhere, and it's going to be really, really, really satisfying when you are just dominating. So for the actual pros and cons then, it is relatively fast, as you can see. It has everything available to it to tackle all content, and it is really well-rounded as a league starter, meaning therefore it is quite beginner friendly and there aren't too many nuances that are going to make it massively difficult. The cons though, you will have to balance your armor and evasion a bit, and that can become tricky. It does also, like I said, require some melee playstyle, especially on bosses, to do the maximum damage available, and it is going to rely on a few uniques to get your maximum potential in the later game. I would say, though, it's very easy at transitioning, and it's great for new players. Playstyle is easy. Gearing it isn't too difficult. I would put that at a sort of medium level, and it's fairly easily executable as well. If you are looking to avoid certain map modifiers, while some are generally just bad on their own, such as, for example, a couple of damage modifiers combined with critical strike modifier, these are things that you're actually supposed to, get a feel for yourself and test out. That's the fun of it after all. So just make sure you're not combining too many crazy things together, and modifiers that the build cannot run are going to be no leech and physical damage reflect. You really, really want to avoid those. There are a few interesting mechanics that I want to go over with you. Firstly, the build introduces the Corrupting Fever gem, which you should be popping really regularly to enable champions' adrenaline mastery. Additionally, because of how it works surrounding returning the projectiles, you do need to understand that you should be playing close to the boss, like I said, in a sort of melee caster format, to make sure you're optimizing all of your damage. And other than that, outside of the fact that the build uses life tap support and all of its skills to avoid having to deal with mana, the mechanics are all fairly straightforward. Now moving on, so starting off with Act 1, as I said, this is a league starter build, and therefore we are going to be going through these in some of the acts and what you're going to be building up on the build as you work through campaign here. So you could get Splitting Steel really, really early on, and of course this is actually what makes the foundation build. So what does it actually do then? Well, Splitting Steel is a ranged attack that is actually going to use a melee weapon. So you launch the projectiles and you consume something called a steel shard. That is then going to split out and deal physical damage. And then it's going to come with a second skill called Call of Steel. This is used to replenish steel shard charges while dealing AoE damage. It's going to remove Impale to deal reflected damage based on the amount of impales inflicted. And this is really simple to use. And a lot of you may already be familiar with it, as it is available since level 1. So it is also one of the best leveling tools if you are going duelist, and is really efficient, as what it does is you can apply the attack to use its physical form and benefit from impale, as the skill increases the chance of impaling by 60%. Really, really great with Call of Steel. And if you're thinking about these kind of skills, Champion is the ascendancy that would generally come to mind. If you're new and you're like, does it? Then don't worry, I am going to be going through that short. So just going through these Act 1 gems then, and what they kind of do. Splitting Steel is the one that actually is going to deal physical projectile damage with your melee weapon, and it's going to do an additional high chance of impaling. You, of course, do want to make sure you have steel shards at hand. Leap Slam pretty much does what it says on the tin. You're going to leap and slam down on the ground, dealing damage to your enemies. Sniper's Mark over here. The enemy basically gets marked. This is to a single enemy at the moment with the curse, and they receive increased projectile damage, and the projectiles are additionally split on impact, which, of course, is where the splitting comes in this Splitting Steel build. Now, I will put this POB link in the description so you can go through each act and see what you should be getting at each part. In Act 2, as you can see, a few things here have changed very slightly. And while in Act 2, while you're leveling through the campaign, if you have chosen this as your league starter, then one thing you need to be aware of is that when you go to the Bandits quest, it is actually going to make a difference to your game in which order you kill them, or if you kill them at all. So like I said, the Bandit quest actually all unfolds in Act 2. And this is where you're going to make the first important decision to your character. There is actually 4 options to complete this quest, and the game doesn't really tell you this either. Well, it does tell you, but it doesn't really tell you that there's a big outcome to actually doing this. You could either help one of the bandits by killing the other 2 and turning in their amulets to the 3rd, in which case they will grant you their bonus. And should you decide to kill all 3 of them, Eramir will be giving you an extra skill point. That's back at the quest giver. So the bonuses by the bandits are given as follows. Alira will give you a 15% elemental resistance. Oak is going to give you plus 40 to maximum life. And Kratin is going to give you 8% movement speed. So you can choose your bandit quest reward by trading 20 regrets and the correct type of amulet to a vendor, by the way. But which one are we going to use? So for this build specifically, skill points are really, really important. And therefore we should be killing all of the bandits to get extra skill points. Early on, you could be using Alira, but honestly, I think that you're just going to want to swap that out pretty soon after anyway, and therefore killing all of them is going to be the best choice here. Another thing that you're going to get as you are leveling up is your Pan, which is what you see here. Pantheons get introduced to the game after the month where you kill Tokahama. So once you've killed them, you're basically, well, once you've killed the Brine King, you should then allocate. So we're going to press Y on our keybinds as long as you haven't changed them, and this is going to open the Pantheon pane. Whenever you kill Pantheon bosses during the campaign, that is when you can then allocate their benefit. This is the build I would recommend here for your Pan, and if you're wondering what order to go in, then I would come towards Master of Metal first, then come up to Fortitude, then it's going to be First to Strike, Last to Fall, and lastly, we're going to be coming over to Inspiration. Now, you can read through what they offer and don't offer in your own time. I'm trying not to overwhelm you in this one as it is a league starter. So I'm just sort of touching on what we should be going for and slightly on why for it. Going back to the gems then, which we can see here, what are the ones that we are going to be aiming for in the later game in the full setup? So obviously we've got our splitting steel here, where you fire a single projectile that splits on impact or at the targeted location, dealing area damage when it splits, and again when the split projectiles explode at the end of their flight. This does require a sword or axe, and you do need to be aware of it. We're going to be adding awakened vicious projectiles to this, returning projectile support, where they basically will return to you like a boomerang. We're going with awakened brutality, awakened increased area of effect, and life tap. It's pretty obvious what the awakened increased area of effect does. It's in the name. And for the brutality, this is going to deal increased physical damage. Now, you may notice on here that some of these are actually called awakened, including vicious projectile. So what are awakened gems? So you basically have your normal gems, and then you have the awakened versions of these. Versions are generally going to be a lot more powerful than the more easily or readily available regular gems. Therefore, they should be purchased whenever you can afford them, the awakened ones. When the gems listed that I've shown here mention awakened in the name, these are the ones that you're trying to get the more upgraded versions of when possible. Now, for some people, this may be really OTT trying to level these up because it's obviously a lot more expensive. So you could just buy a leveled version if you can, or you can buy something called Wild Bramblebuck Beasts and use the Menagerie craft to upgrade increased level of non-corrupted awakened gems by 1. If that's all just sounding a bit confusing and crazy, then basically these are the gems you want. Don't worry too much about awakened until you're a bit more comfortable with everything else. Your Leap Slam is your utility and movement gem. You jump into the air, damaging and knocking back enemies within your weapon where you land, and enemies you would land on are pushed out of the way. This is coming with Maim, faster attacks, and life tap, where Maim is going to be doing more physical damage. Faster attacks, of course, is going to be faster, and life tap basically means that the supported skill is actually going to cost life rather than mana. For our auras, we're going for Grace, Determination with Pride and Enlighten. Grace gives you an aura that grants evasion to you and your allies. Determination gives you an aura that grants armor to you and your allies. Pride grants an aura where nearby enemies take more physical damage. And then the Enlighten support that we're putting with our Pride basically increases experience. We're also going to put Arrogance with Precision. So So what does precision do? Again, this casts an aura that grants accuracy and critical strike chance to your allies, and arrogance is the support part of this, where they reserve life instead of mana. We then have our defense gems and utility, like our Val Molten Shell. TLDR, this applies a buff that raises your armor and takes some of the damage from hits for you before being depleted. So basically, you can imagine this as like a sort of shield absorb, if you will. And then we're going for Corrupting Fever as well here, which basically draws out your own blood to power a buff for a short duration, letting this skill inflict the Corrupting Blood debuff on enemies you hit, dealing physical damage over time for a short secondary duration. This buff's duration will be refreshed if you spend enough life before it expires. Now moving on to the gear we want and the stats that we actually want on it, including our jewels and flasks. So first of all, if you are a new player, I want to really emphasize that early game, I cannot emphasize enough how important your elemental resistances are on gear. This game is actually constructed around playing with at least 75% elemental resistance, and ideally a bit of chaos resistance as well. And therefore you should always be looking to cap your resistances. They should be capped starting from about Act 5 until the end of your progression, and you should try and upgrade with chaos resistances where you can as you progress through maps in the sort of early, mid and end game. Additionally, generally you may have issues finding enough attributes on your builds, and you should note that almost every class path through a passage where they can pick up to about 30 intelligence, strength or dexterity, and there is no shame in doing so whilst you are still preparing to get your better and better gear. What I've noticed is a lot of people will try and put this off just because they feel like they won't need it later. But honestly, you do you and do what you need to do to survive, because it is not an easy game. If we're speaking specifically about the progression in this build, when you start your journey through the maps, you're going to want to aim for a lot of life and resistances on all of your gear, excluding your weapons. This is just to make sure that you are actually capped on resistances and have a decent health pool so that we can survive. And generally, you're going to do fine with that for quite a while. At that point, though, you are still mostly carried by your skill gems and your passive skill tree, linked in the description, by the way. And therefore, we want to make sure that we have all the suggested gems when you start doing your maps, and that you've fixed your links and sockets when you're able to. You could really struggle if you do not do this as early on as possible before starting. Lastly then, don't forget to get your quality up on your gear using your armorer scraps. This is multiplicative, and therefore the bonus on all the defenses is found on your item. So what gear do we actually want to choose? Generally, I try to give these stats in order of importance so that you can put together a sort of pyramid of importance on the stats that you want. But sometimes items are just purely mandatory. But really, other than that, if you follow the priority list that I'm giving you and try and obtain as many of them as you can, you should, fingers crossed, be fine. But of course, the more you can get that are relevant, the better. So the gear I'm showing here is generally more end game, and do be aware that depending on the stats, etc., obviously you can make different choices as you go through progression. For the helmet, I would go for an evasion helmet, and you should generally try and get percentage reduced mana cost of your attacks, and also increased mana reservation efficiency of your skills, and I would go for at least 8. For the kind of things that you absolutely must try and get that are explicit on the headpiece, I would go for maximum life, ideally over 99. Percentage increase to elemental resistances, of course, as much as you need to cap out your resistances, and then chaos resistances where possible. I would also add some accuracy until it is higher than your life. Going straight down into the body armor, I would try and go for the unique Lion Eyes Vision. Only 2 explicit stats that I would want you to get on here are percentage to increased armor, about 250, and plus to life again over 100 where possible. For the gloves, again, percentage chance to suppress all spell damage would be good, and gaining rage on hit with your attacks, and as much evasion as you can get to the total of over 1,000. Maximum life, again, ideally over 80 would be fantastic, and again, elemental resistances as much as you need to cap. Adding some accuracy until your accuracy, again, is higher than life is ideal on the gloves as well. And on the boots, there's a few things we're going to really want. As much evasion as you can get to over 1,000 is going to be really important here, and getting more and more maximum life over 8. Again, get those resistances up, and movement speed is going to be absolutely fantastic for speeding you up mapping. A few extra stats you could try and get but aren't as needed are going to be chances to avoid elemental ailments like post-ancestral vision, and increased action speed. I would really recommend trying to get Perseverance as a unique belt with increased maximum life and elemental resistances again on here. Everything else is kind of whatever you get. For your amulet, I would go for the Fury Vow, trying to get any sort of attributes and sovereignty, anoint on here for the best stats on that. I would also, again, try and get your resistances and some evasion rating where possible. On the rings, you can pretty much just go for rare rings, trying to get chaos resistance where possible on here. Apart from that, we can go for more elemental resistances, any attributes as needed, upping our accuracy until it, again, is higher than life, non-channeling skills to have a total mana cost, and maximum life over 60 with some evasion rating would be preferred. Dream Feather is a good early game weapon. In the late game, though, Paradoxica would be the perfect one that you should get here, with increased physical damage, attack speed, dexterity, and intelligence. On your other hand, I would go for the Bell Timber Blade, getting increased attack damage and attack speed as well on this one. And then now going on to the flasks that you would want, I would start off with a Divine Life Flask, a Granite Flask, Jade Flask, Basalt, and Quicksilver Flask. You're going to want to gain as many charges as you can when you are hit by an enemy with Utility Flask, instant recovery when low on life from your life. You're going to really want to try and get increased evasion rating on your utility flasks, as well as increased armor rating during effect on your utility, and lastly, increased movement speed during the effect as well. You could also get increased attack speed during the effect as well. And on your life flasks, those previous 4 ones were all for utility. And then on your life flasks, you're going to want gaining immunity to bleeding for X amount of seconds while bleeding. Moving now on to the jewels here that you're going to want. For your large cluster jewels, you're going to want to add passive. Let's say passive is Battle Hardened, Master of Fundamentals, and Force Multiply. Also, Feed the Fury, Fuel the Fight, and Martial Prowess. These are the ones that I would recommend trying to get on here. However, I do not recommend buying a large jewel cluster until it has at least 3 notables and only 8 passive. On your medium jewel cluster, I would say a maximum of 5 passive skills. Adding passive is going to be Eye to Eye or Repeater. And on your regular jewel, which can have a multitude of relevant damage modifiers, these can above state the priority, which are going to be pretty mandatory. Chance to impale enemies on hit with attacks, increased maximum life, increased attack speed, and increased attack speed with swords. I would generally say that obtaining jewels that do have at least 3 stats on isn't going to be for you. And for your unique jewel, I would go for the Eye or Lethal Pride. If you do go for the Watcher's Eye, this is going to hopefully have Impale with your last Inflict, has additional hits when using Pride, which is obviously a gem we are using. You can see up here. Or otherwise, with Lethal Pride, we're mainly going for strength, with damage, fortification, or maybe something like armor. Bringing it all to a conclusion then, just to recap on how this build plays, it's a ranged attack called Splitting Steel. And this is going to be using a melee weapon, remember? You're launching out projectiles, consuming something called Steel Shards that's going to split and deal physical damage. The second skill that comes with this is called Call of Steel. And this is used to replenish Steel Shard charges while dealing AoE damage. It's going to remove impact, deal reflected damage based on the amount of impales inflicted. And it's really simple to use. And remember that most of you are probably familiar with this as it is available from level 1. It's going to be one of the best leveling tools if you are using a League starter and this is a duelist build that you're looking for. So the most efficient way to actually apply the attack is to use its physical form and then benefit from impact. We're going to go in for the Champion Ascendancy with this build as well, which can basically enhance melee attacks with its Master of Metal Key, which allows for extra impales on your enemies and adds a ton of physical damage and armor. Unstoppable Hurto and Fortitude guarantee a permanent 24 to 5 stun immunity, 20% increased attack speed, armor, and evasion, while Inspirational is an overall improvement for your performance. This basically makes for a great character with tons of armor and also evasion, which is going to be magnified by your Grace and Determination gem, and the effect of which is increased with Inspiration. Add to that the nearly 100% chance to suppress spell damage and the aforementioned Fortify, and you've got yourself an extremely tanky and to deal meaningful damage with it. However, you're going to want to equip a pair of swords with high yes, allocating Point Blank Keystone, Anoint Vengeance Cascade, and we're going to be trying to reach 100% critical strike chance where possible. How it's actually going to play then? Well, we're using our Splitting Steel at and Call of Steel if we run out of sharp. Due to all the chaining and AoE we were doing, it's great for clear with keeping bosses close by in a melee range to benefit from our point blank and using the Call of Steel during their invulnerability phasing. We're only going to use one Ancestral Totem, which is going to be Ancestral Protector for more attack speed. And Blood Rage is going to get us more attack speed. Any Life Leech and Frenzy charges as well. For the curses, we're obviously using Sniper's Mark and Vulnerability. And we're going to be implementing our Molten Shell for a guard spell. Auras, we've obviously got Vitality, Grace, Determination, Pride. This overall is a really, really fun build where we're just shooting out loads of projectiles, reflecting back in on us to deal insane amounts of damage and makes a fantastic. Now, if you have enjoyed this video, please do, of course, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and check out the other builds that I am actually doing for PoE 3.25 Settlers of Kalguur.